change directions, turning around so I could get onto the street she thought we should be taking. However, there were times when my brother-in-law disagreed with the backseat directions, so we ended up turning around again and again and again. It's what seemed to be endless drives through parking lots or making as many U-turns as I could safely or not so safely manage. I have to say I saw very little of the beach on that trip, just being thankful that somehow we had managed to get ourselves turned around enough times so that we found our hotel by the end of the day. By the time evening had rolled around, I was thrilled and thankful that I could finally park the car in the hotel lot and find some peace and quiet. Now I'm telling you this story because maybe Jonah had some trouble finding his place in his story. The truth is that Jonah just kept going around in circles, constantly changing directions. When God first speaks to our reluctant prophet, we know he does everything in his power to turn away from God's voice. He intentionally changes directions and heads off to find a safe place to hide. Little did our friend Jonah know that his hiding place was in a great big fish. There he stays for 3 days, and then finally Jonah sees the light, so to speak, and agrees to do what God wanted Jonah to do in the first place. The fish lets out a great big burp, and out pops Jonah, safe and sound on land. You know, I think we all love this story. We enjoy being able to laugh and joke about it. Eugene Peterson, who has written The Message, writes this about Jonah. Jonah has entered our folklore. There is a playful aspect to his story, a kind of slapstick clumsiness about Jonah as he bumbles his way along, but always unsuccessfully, to avoid God. But the playfulness is not frivolous. This is deadly serious, Peterson writes. While we are smiling or laughing at Jonah, we drop the guard with which we are trying to keep God at a comfortable distance, and suddenly we find ourselves caught in the purposes and commands of God. All of us, no exceptions. Peterson continues, one reason the Jonah story is so enduringly important for nurturing the life of faith in us is that Jonah is not a hero too high and mighty for us to identify right. He doesn't do anything great. Instead of being held up as an ideal to admire, we find Jonah as a companion in our ineptness. Here is someone on our level. Even when Jonah does it right, he does it wrong. But the whole time, God is working within and around Jonah's very ineptness and accomplishing God's purposes in him. So let's look at the rest of the story. Jonah does indeed change his directions and heads off to Nineveh and preaches his sermon to the very first Ninevites he runs into. You see, Jonah had no intention of getting involved with those dirty, nasty Ninevites. You see, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians were the enemy to the people of Israel. As far as Jonah was concerned, the Ninevites didn't deserve any message from God. They needed to be punished. On top of that, Jonah knows very well what usually happened in God's messengers. They never ended up healthy and well cared for. Being a messenger of God was very risky, if not downright dangerous. Now, even though Jonah found himself on the road to Nineveh, he was determined not to stay any longer than he had to. His plan was to deliver God's message and hightail it to safety as quickly as he could. As Jonah walked along, he came came up with the shortest sermon ever preached. It's only a few words. In 40 days, Nineveh will be smashed. That's all Jonah said. And evidently, that's all it took. According to the story, the people of Nineveh got themselves turned around and repented. Everyone changed their clothes. They wore sackcloth and ashes from the king on down. Even the animals were wrapped up in burlap and fasted along with everyone else. God saw it all and decided to relent. God forgave Nineveh. God was so moved that God's mercy, love, and grace was poured out on the people and animals of Nineveh. How great is God? And we might want to end the story there. Everybody lives happily ever after. Nineveh are restored to God's grace. People dance in the streets, happy and relieved that life will go on. There's one person who is really and angry and upset with God. It's Jonah. And he is furious with God. He just can't understand why God would do such a thing. Didn't God realize what horrible, nasty people the Ninevites were? Didn't God understand that no self-respecting, faithful member of God's community would ever be caught dead associating with the likes of the Ninevites? How could God forgive such undeserving, mean creatures? It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. As a matter of fact, Jonah is so upset with God that Jonah declares he would rather die than live with the notion that he had actually helped the Ninevites turn their lives around. So needless to say, Jonah is in a very bad mood. So he goes off by himself for a good sulk and some self-satisfying pouting. But the thing is, it was hot and sticky out there in the desert where Jonah had gone to nurse his anger. And so he says, "Gee whiz, God, if you could just see your way clear to give me some shade, I'd be thankful." You see, even in his anger, Jonah is still able to ask God for what he wants. I guess Jonah is one of those people who is never satisfied and figures that God owes him something for his efforts. Whatever the case, God hears Jonah, and suddenly a shade-giving bush appears, and now Jonah can continue his pouting in comfort. Feeling a bit better about life, Jonah takes it easy under the shade. Then the next morning, the bush has shriveled up and died, so our buddy Jonah is once again sitting in the hot, blazing sun. Well, that's just about the last straw for Jonah. He's not only angry about those terrible Ninevites being saved, his anger is doubled because God took away the one thing that made Jonah comfortable. "That's it, God," Jonah cried. "You can save the Ninevites, those dirty, rotten scoundrels, but you can't let me have 1 ounce of comfort. I'm better off dead. Just come and take me now." And God answers, but maybe not the way we'd expect. God says to Jonah, "What right have you got to complain, Jonah? You're forgetting. I'm God. I'm the one who gets to decide whom I'm going to forgive. And by the way, those dirty, rotten scoundrels you call the Ninevites repented, in case you forgot, and turned their lives around. And so why should not forgive them? What you need to do, Jonah, is turn yourself around one more time. Get over the senseless hating of the Ninevites. Give it all up. Give up all those wounds and hurts that are choking you. When you do that, you'll find out what the Ninevites have discovered, that indeed I am a loving, forgiving, and grace-filled God. Turn around. Release and let go of all those things that are keeping us from really knowing God. That's what the story of Jonah is really all about. more fish story to share with you. It's not important, but I'm going to do it anyway. Once upon a time, there was a fisherman who had a fantastic reputation for his ability to catch fish. Every day, he would go out on his boat and bring back an incredibly large number of fish, and his reputation spread far and wide. One day, a stranger approached the fisherman, expressing his desire to go fishing with him. The fisherman said, "Okay, come back tomorrow morning around 4:30 and we'll go." Next morning, the two men got into the boat. The stranger was puzzled by what he saw. All the fisherman carried was an old rusty green tackle box and a net. There weren't any fishing poles, no casting rods, no reels, nothing. The two motored across the lake and ended up in a secluded cove. The fisherman opened his rusty tackle box and pulled out a red stick of dynamite. He took the match, very carefully struck it, as the stranger's eyes grew wide. He lit the fuse and tossed the stick over his shoulder. When the dynamite exploded in the water, fish began rising to the surface. Very calmly, the fisherman began dipping his net into the water and tossing fish into the boat. The stranger then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, opened it up to reveal a shiny metal badge. He was a game warden. "You're under arrest. It's against the law to dynamite for fish." Very calmly, the fisherman reached down into that nasty old tackle box and pulled out a second stick of dynamite, struck a match, lit the fuse, and handed the dynamite to the game warden. Confused, the game warden took the dynamite, fuse burning in his hand. The fisherman, with a gleam in his eye and a glee at his voice, said, "Are you gonna fish or just sit there?" Our gospel lesson today is known as a call story. It's the story of Jesus calling 4 disciples, Andrew, Simon, James, and John. As you can imagine, lots and lots of theologians and scholars have speculated about just how it was that these 4 appeared to drop everything and decide to follow Jesus that day on the beach. Now, I don't think Jesus used any dynamite to demonstrate his fishing expertise. I don't think Jesus even cast a net that day. After all, his intention wasn't to go fishing for fish. Indeed, Jesus knew just exactly who he wanted to come and follow him that day. As one writer has pointed out, it could have been that Simon, Andrew, John, and James were somewhat familiar with Jesus. News spread quickly in those days. Do you remember something called word of mouth? Gossip around the fishing boats, town centers, and watering holes traveled like wildfire, especially in the Galilee region. Word was getting around about Jesus, so maybe it was somewhat natural that these 4 would be disciples were curious about this Jesus guy and what he had to offer. Remarkably, these 4 appear eager to sign up for this disciple business, leaving their livelihoods and loved ones behind, willing to set out for the unknown. Now, as we know, often these followers didn't exactly live up to great expectations. They behaved badly from time to time. They made poor decisions. They asked silly questions. They moaned, groaned, complained, and argued. They sometimes behaved as badly as our friend Jonah. In other words, they were ordinary people just like us, and with all sorts of faults and shortcomings, with hurts and prejudices. Like Jonah, they often felt that only those who behave well should receive God's gifts of love and forgiveness. Barbara Brown when undeserved blessings come our way, we're convinced that undeserved blessings should only go to those who deserve them. In other words, many of us are convinced that we can, by our good decisions and good deeds, save ourselves. But, and this is the whole point of today's stories, God does not keep track of things the way we do. God doesn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about who is worthy and who isn't. We are the bookkeepers, not God. It may not be fair from where we sit, yet from where God sits, we're all a mess. Maybe in God's eyes, we should look more like hurt, sick, lost. We look more like hurt, sick, lost children who are all in deep need of mercy. If you take anything home with you today about these stories, take this. It is the transforming power of God to recruit people who have made terrible choices, who are just ordinary human beings with all sorts of troubles and pain. These are people God is reaching out to welcome into God's realm of love, forgiveness, and mercy. We are the silly, judgmental, fragile, and sometimes unwilling people God is searching for. Come and see. Come and be embraced in the arms of God's enduring and extravagant love. And each of us learned something today, that God doesn't keep score the way we do. That's the miracle. Thank God for Jonah, Simon, Andrew, John, and James, and all of us who don't deserve the love and mercy we receive from God, yet thankfully we have it anyway, in spite of ourselves. Amen. As we enter into our time of prayer this morning, are there joys to be shared? Sun is shining. Along with joys, we often have concerns, and there are concerns to be lifted up. Let us come to God in prayer. Loving God, we live